Our scripture reading today comes from the book of Genesis. Just a little bit of background. Today's story continues the unfolding of the events in Jacob's life. Just before what you'll hear today, Jacob is heading home with his family and a huge herd of animals, his wealth. Heading home means facing his brother Esau again. When last they were together, Jacob had tricked their father Isaac, which enraged Esau. Esau pledged to kill Jacob if ever they met again, and so Jacob fled. As Jacob approaches home, he sends word to Esau that he is returning. The messenger returns, saying Esau is coming to meet Jacob with 400 men. Terrified, Jacob prays to God, saying, "You said to me, return to your country and to your kindred, and I will do you good. Deliver me, please, from the hand of my brother." So Jacob tries to do what he can to keep his family and his animals safe. Chapter 32, verses 22 to 31. The same night he got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He, that is Jacob, took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything he had. Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him in the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, the mystery man said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And so the stranger said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." And the stranger said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have struggled with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But the stranger said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. May these words be to us our light and our life.
Thanks be to God.
As I mentioned before, it is the season of hungry caterpillars. Juicy leaves swollen with summer sun and prairie rains are plentiful, spread out like an endless green banquet table. As you know, caterpillars are eating machines. Monarch caterpillars will eat the equivalent of 200 times their birth weight before they enter their cocoon, all within about 2 weeks. All that eating increases their size, but also prepares them for the radical and mysterious transformation in the cocoon. What does really happen in there? Eric Carl's colorful book is less than helpful with that part. On one page there's the brown cocoon, and on the next there's the colorful butterfly. Scientists, like Candy, have studied the hidden steps in between and tried to describe what happens. A few years ago, Scientific American described it simply this way: the caterpillar digests itself. Now, this may be the PG part of the sermon, but apparently the caterpillar releases an enzyme that actually dissolves all of its body parts except for a few highly organized cells. This caterpillar soup surrounding these cells fuels them to become the butterfly's wings, legs, and body. The caterpillar digests itself, then reforms and emerges out of this primordial ooze. And this caught my attention as I reflected on the connection between Eric Carle's book and what happens to Jacob as he wrestles with the angel. Could Jacob's story be another way of imagining an encounter with the self-dissolving love we see throughout the scriptures and eventually in Jesus? Well, if you read the whole story up to this point, you know that Jacob is not such a great guy. The name Jacob means he deceives, and he does everything he can to live up to this name. Jacob stole his twin brother Esau's birthright, basically starving him until he promised it to Jacob. Jacob also pretended to be his brother Esau, fooling their blind elderly father into giving Jacob the blessing and therefore the family wealth meant for Esau. Then there is the deception surrounding Rachel and Leah that you all heard last Sunday. We won't go through all that again. And just before today's story, Jacob swindles his father-in-law out of all the good and strong animals in his herd. Over and over, Jacob shows us what selfishness, greed, and deception are all about. We know the type. Achieve success by any means available. Prey on the vulnerabilities of others. Force your way to the top, to the front. Maintain power and control by any means necessary. If we're paying attention, we see this kind of behavior daily, and sometimes even in other people too. Right? But that way of being comes from a place of loneliness and desperation, from a deep sense of disconnection from one another, from the world, and from God. And when I heard about yesterday's bombing at the mosque in Bloomington, I thought about the loneliness and desperation that must be behind that kind of hate. This crime blames Muslims for that pain. It is the triumph of that part in all of us that believes we alone have the power to overcome loneliness and fear if we could just identify and cut off its source. This part of us is what the Trappist monk Thomas Merton called the false self. He writes, quote, "All separateness starts with the assumption that my false self, the self that exists only in my own egocentric desires, is the fundamental reality of life around which everything else is to be ordered. Thus, I use up my life in the desire for pleasures and the thirst for experiences, for power and honor and knowledge, feeling loved in order to clothe this false self and construct its nothingness into something real, as if I were an invisible body that could only become visible when something covered its surface." End quote. And to me, this is a perfect description of Jacob's life up to this point. He clings to lies like they were the only clothes he owned. And even when God tried to wake him up through the dream of that ladder leading up out of his quagmire, Jacob chooses to stay attached to his false self. Which brings us to today's story. We find Jacob on the eve of his reunion with Esau. Remember, Esau pledged to kill Jacob if ever he saw him again. And there in the terrifying darkness, Jacob is confronted by a mysterious man. Now we don't know the stranger's identity. An angel? A demon? God? The encounter is both spiritual and physical. They wrestle until dawn. But like the mysteries within the cocoon, we don't see what happens within Jacob's long night of the soul. But by morning, he's changed, transfigured, transformed. The stranger strikes Jacob's hip and painfully puts it out of socket. Transformation leaves its mark on us. But Jacob stubbornly will not let go, demanding something in return, a blessing. You have striven with God, you have struggled with God and with humans and have prevailed, the wrestling spirit says. Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel. The name Israel means struggled with God. Instead of blessing the deceitful, selfish Jacob, the Spirit takes that identity away and replaces it with a new identity rooted in relationship with God. But is Jacob really changed? What happens next is telling. In chapter 33, the next day, when Esau and his men catch up to Jacob, now Israel, Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. Jacob is stunned by Esau's love and forgiveness, and we see the beginning of Jacob finding his true self, humbled by redemptive love. Perhaps this wrestling match was really between Jacob's false self and the power of God's redemptive love. I wonder if you know this struggle in your own life. It might look differently for each of us. It might feel more like a dance or a conversation, but somewhere this selfless love is working to loosen our attachment to our false self. My false self needs you all to love this sermon. But my true self only needs me to worship God in all I do. The false self's only goal is to justify its own separate existence. Our true self knows we only exist because we are connected to all things through God in whom all things exist. For me, following Jesus, being a Christian, leads me to confront my false self and recognize when someone else may be operating out of their own false self. That is one way to understand, I think, what Jesus' ministry is all about. And through it all, he demonstrated what a self-denying, self-dissolving love really looked like. Nowhere is this perhaps more apparent, more real to us than at this table. Jesus used the bread and cup as symbols of God's redeeming love and an invitation beyond the brokenness and desperation of life. Now let's face it, sometimes being a Christian does feel like a wrestling match. But out of the struggle, we can emerge transformed and see ourselves more and more as God sees us. So today, as you come to this table, do so bringing your own longing to embrace your true self. Blessed, loved, connected. Amen.